Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. If you don't know me, I am Eleanor Steele, and I work as the MedComms mentor, and I also run the MedComms workbook for freelancers in this wonderful industry. So today we are talking about the results from the MedComms Freelancing Barometer 2026, a survey that ran recently, and we're going to be looking at this in terms of the full data set and the data in terms of comparison with the last 2 years, and also looking at it from different geographical perspectives. So I'm going to start off by presenting a quick overview of the full data set, and I will just share my screen so you can see my slides. There we go. So, as I said, this was a survey of freelancers working in and around MedComms. It was an anonymous survey so that we could get very candid answers, and this includes free text comments, which are very interesting if you want to read those. It was run in January of 2026. And this repeats the pattern that we did in 2024 and 2025 as well. And the questions look back at the previous year. Now, this isn't a longitudinal study. We don't know whether the same people have responded in each year. There probably are a few repeat customers, which is lovely, but it's almost certainly not the same group overall. The full data are freely available, and I will be posting a link to that shortly, but it will also be available with the recording once this goes out after today's session. So let's have a think about the demographics, who actually responded to this survey. So the first question was, where are you based? And this gives quite a broad brush overview of where the respondents were based. And it's broadly similar to the previous 2 years, although slightly more UK centric. We've got a similar proportion of responses from the US and Canada than in previous years, but the biggest change, I think, is a lower response rate in Europe, which is quite interesting. We've also received fewer responses this year in comparison with the previous two, and that's something I want to explore a little bit later. And in terms of the type of freelancers that we had responding to the survey, it's been pretty similar every year, with around 70 to 75% of respondents reporting that they are predominantly medical writers. How long have you worked in MedComms? So this is always an interesting question, and I think we have got pretty similar experience levels in terms of time in MedComms over all of the years, although I think the respondents were slightly more experienced this year than in the previous two. And this is similar to what we see when asking how long people have freelanced in MedComms. Again, a similar time reported in all 3 years of the survey, but I think a slightly more experienced bunch this year, but it's not a huge difference. The majority of people who have responded to the survey in all 3 years have said that freelancing was their sole source of income. Several people mention also doing some journalism or non-MedComms type writing. If they are doing sort of freelancing in MedComms as part of a more portfolio career. And one or two people mentioned that they are freelancing part-time as they are transitioning into retirement to supplement their pension. That brings us on to freelance income, and I think this is one of the hot topics in the survey. So this starts off by looking at how many hours people worked and whether it was as many as they wanted or not. This year, we had a pretty strong response that almost 63% of people said yes, they had worked as many hours as they wanted. And this shows an interesting progression from the last couple of years, where people looking back at 2023 really had not worked as much as they had wanted. More than half of respondents hadn't. So it looks as though the industry is hopefully coming back into a bit more of a fruitful time. However, the free text comments that accompany this question are still showing a mixed picture. They're really worth reading, especially if you had a hard time last year. So, some of the people who reported that they had worked as many hours as they had wanted achieved this by having to be more flexible than they really wanted, or accepting suboptimal situations and work that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise have accepted. Some freelancers also noted that there was an impact around the uncertainty in the US, particularly around medicine and science, given the current US administration. And this has caused challenges in pharma and the broader scientific and medical community. Some people noted that they had experienced enough work overall, but did not necessarily have enough work all the time. Feast or famine was a phrase that came up quite regularly in the comments. And the industry does seem to sort of lack middle ground. There were plenty of people saying, yes, I had lots and lots of work, it was great, but also people reporting the absolute opposite. They did not have enough work and they were struggling. So there do seem to be extremes of experience even within this one question. Did your income match your expectations? So again, this is showing positive momentum in comparison with the last 2 years. So continued recovery following the slump that we experienced in the industry post-COVID. People, again, have given some really insightful comments accompanying this question and talking about gaps between projects really impacting their annual income, even for those who were generally busy and did work enough hours, did earn enough. It was potentially a bit more unstable than they were hoping for. When people did earn as much as they were expecting, often this was because there were periods where they were overworking and saying yes to everything rather than keeping a nice sustainable workload throughout the year. There were also some strategic trade-offs where people intentionally stepped back from their original income expectations, needing to spend more time with their families or doing other things outside of their freelance work. Rates. So this is always something that people are very interested in, and it looks like there are also positive trends in terms of what is happening with people's average rate, which we can see in comparison with the previous 2 years of surveys. Now, the comments showed that some people are looking at this strategically and putting up their rate for new clients, but not negotiating with existing clients, which is quite a low risk strategy, but it also means that growth of their income will potentially be slower. And it's going to be more complicated administratively as well to make sure that you're charging the right rate to different clients. Quite a few freelancers noted that they hadn't raised their rates in 2 to 3 years and finally corrected this in 2025, which is nice to hear. One of those freelancers literally said that they had raised their rate based on the survey results from last year. This has given them confidence, which is lovely to hear. So thank you to whoever that was. I'm really glad that this survey has helped. Some people have held their rates steady over the last few years because of the tough market, but those who did increase their rates faced little resistance. People were pleasantly surprised that clients accepted these rate increases despite the anxiety that they may have had before having those negotiations. So rate increases are happening, but gradually and cautiously, but clients seem to be more accepting of increases than freelancers expect, which is quite nice. Rates might not be keeping pace with inflation, so it can be a tricky balance, but I would say the message is, if you haven't increased your rates for a while, now might be the time to do it. Thinking about clients, we also have looked at how many clients people are working for throughout the whole year. And this graph is a little bit complex to take in. So I've broken it down into groups where we can see that there are quite a few people who are working with 1 to 3 clients, but the majority have 4 to 6 as their core roster. And then many fewer people are working with over 7, particularly over 10. Now, the comments here mention strategies where people may have two or three anchor clients who provide steady work on a regular basis, and then potentially three to five occasional clients, which gives that greater stability and flexibility if projects get cancelled or things get moved. Quite a few people also commented on the fact that they had clients who they were on the roster for, but then they don't actually receive any work from them. Sometimes due to budget constraints or projects being cut, and sometimes just they're signed up and then don't hear anything more, which can be very frustrating and also mean that people feel like they have more clients that they're working for than they actually do. In terms of annual income, this one is quite an interesting one, I think, where we have nearly half of respondents this year, so 49%, saying that over half of their annual income was from their biggest client. This is in comparison with 44%, which was reported in both of the previous surveys. So we've got a lot of people who are working with 4 to 6 clients, but the income concentration is still lying predominantly with one client. And this is clearly because client numbers don't equal an income distribution across those clients necessarily. Now, relying on a single client isn't necessarily a problem. It can be a deliberate choice, especially if they are a reliable client. But sometimes I think freelancers can run the risk of falling into relying very heavily on one client because they feel their capacity. But this isn't always going to continue indefinitely. And so it's something to watch out for if that is describing your situation. This question always brings up some good comments. Did you get freelance work from recruiters? And we are seeing a very similar picture for the last surveys as well, where around 87% of freelancers say they did not get any work from recruiters. The negative comments around this topic are pretty stark at times. So it's worth having a read of those, especially if you're a recruiter in the field who works with freelancers. But it's not always a negative picture. There are some people who have very positive relationships with specific recruiters. And there are some comments about having recruitment specialists that I trust. That seems to be the key thing. If there is somebody that you trust and have an ongoing relationship with, then it's quite likely you will get work through them. But unfortunately, the majority of people have not got that relationship. And so recruiters are not necessarily getting the best press in this survey. Job satisfaction. This is a crucial one, I think, for freelancers, and really nice to see that 76% reported that they were very satisfied or satisfied with freelancing. That is excellent. But again, there is a more nuanced picture when we look at the comments. So many people love being freelance while simultaneously finding some aspects of maybe the work or the uncertainty quite challenging. Flexibility came out loud and clear as a real driver for freelancing, which is not all that surprising, I think, with people talking about the ability to remotely work, control their hours, and manage family life in the background. But things like the isolation and the fact that flexibility can work both ways and turn into an issue if you don't maintain boundaries was also discussed quite heavily in the comments. The majority of people say that they are unlikely or very unlikely to stop freelancing in 2026. And I think there are a few different groups within this, this sort of set of answers. There are some hardcore freelancers who have said, I will never go back. And there were quite a few comments around bad memories of corporate life. Particularly a few talking about the impact of private equity on the culture in agencies, which seems to have been increasing in the last few years. And the value of autonomy and being able to stay out of the politics is more important to some people than the income stability and benefits of employment. Some people have reported that they have become freelance out of circumstances, partly because of people being made redundant and things like that. And there are also people talking about how they like freelancing, but they would go in-house if necessary. They're not necessarily looking for it, but potentially if they are not getting the consistent, stable work that they need, it is an option that they are looking at. There are also people talking about the transition into another career or into retirement, which freelancing can facilitate. So, gradually curtailing your hours in a controlled way can be a nice way of transitioning from a medcoms career into something else or into retirement. And we had people talking about moving into things like coaching and digital health or something completely different. But nobody threatened to take up pole dancing if medcoms didn't improve soon this year. So hopefully that is also a positive sign for the industry. AI, always a big topic in any conversation at the moment, it seems. And the results here are possibly some of the least surprising, even if it's the biggest difference that we've seen in any of the data, I think. So, in terms of whether people are routinely using Gen AI tools, we now have around 76% of respondents saying they are using AI either a lot or a little, which is nearly double the 40% from just 2 years ago. The comments around this increase in adoption are also really interesting. So we looked at how people are using AI, which I'm going to come onto on the next slide. But for this question, they were talking about why they are using it and why they're not using it in some cases. So client restrictions, confidentiality concerns, and ethical queries are some of the key drivers that mean that people are not using AI tools. Some want to use AI more, but feel that they can't based on those concerns. And it really came across that the non-users have very thoughtful reasons. They're not Luddites. This is not people saying, no, I don't like it. I'm scared of it. I don't want to use it, which, to be honest, was a bit of a flavour coming through the comments from the very first survey when we were looking at this back in early 2024. There were some very resistant comments there, but now it's much more about thinking about whether it is appropriate, whether it's going to be confidential and secure, whether they have access to the right tools with the right privacy settings and things like that. With other people citing the environmental impact as a concern that they had, and others experimenting, but just not yet convinced that it's going to be a useful thing for them to use in their work. So there's measured skepticism rather than fear. In terms of what people are using AI tools for, this is a new question for 2026, and it revealed a kind of hierarchy of trust and value, I think. So the number one use by a landslide was brainstorming and ideation. I think this is really interesting. It's a safe way to use these tools, I think, in a lot of ways, because if you're just trying to get ideas, there's not going to be the same confidentiality issues that there would exist if you were looking at data. It's augmentative. It's looking at how you can use AI to build together. It's not replacing your own creativity. So you can use a tool as a sparring partner rather than a replacement. And as a freelancer, I think this is particularly useful because we don't have that person sitting next door who we can go, do you have a minute? Let's just chat through this if that's okay. We need somebody else to do that, and AI is very handy when there isn't anybody else working in the same office as you. We've also got people reporting that they're using it for literature searching and explaining complex concepts. And I think this is really important for freelancers. We often have to get up to speed on new therapeutic areas and find relevant sources very, very quickly. And this will help us do that. Obviously, we need to check everything, but it can be a real time saver. There's also evidence that people are using multiple different tools and multiple different approaches with AI. It's not that people were selecting one option and one option only. And also the comments outline the different tools people are using for different types of things. So it's a good idea to look at those comments if you would like some ideas about how you could do that if you're one of the people who's not yet sure about using AI. Something I do want to highlight though is that on this question, we only had 14% of respondents saying that they don't use any AI tools. And if you remember on the previous slide, we had 23% reporting that they don't use AI. So this suggests to me that on the previous question, there are some people who are ticking, no, I don't use AI because they don't maybe think of themselves as the kind of person who uses AI or can't think of what they might use it for. But then faced with a list of actual tasks that they could use an AI tool to help them with, they go, oh, yeah, actually, I do that. Yeah, I do use it for that. So I think looking at that gap is quite interesting as well. I'm going to finish up here with some quick conclusions, though. I think we've got a mixed picture, but I think the industry is continuing to improve and get back to stability, although it's not happening across the board and it's not necessarily happening particularly quickly. Most freelancers, however, do seem to be satisfied with their role, and AI adoption is increasing in a strategic way, I would say, but we do still have concerns that exist. In general, though, freelancers are pretty optimistic, although there are concerns and people who are not having a great time because of the market fluctuations and the evolution of the industry. We are going to be running this survey again in 2027, so do please keep in touch so that you can get that link and also come to this webinar this time next year. And I just want to end this quick overview with a thank you to everybody who responded to the survey and everybody who helped with getting the message out there. So I am going to stop sharing my screen now. There we go. And Laurie, would you like to give us a little overview of the US perspective?
Sure. Let me get my slides up.
Thank you. Oh, can you switch display? Sorry, we're seeing the presenter
Yeah.
view, not slideshow.
Oh, yes. I clicked I'm used to clicking.
Sure.
All right, there you
There we
go.
go. Perfect.
Okay, so it's great to see so many people here because it's really important that we all keep up with what's going on in our field. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the US and Canada, mostly the US. So I compared the percentages for the US and Canada to everybody who took the survey, and about 20% more freelancers everywhere had as much work as they wanted compared to freelancers in the US. Experience is a key factor in how much work people have. About 5% more freelancers everywhere had 6 to 20 years of freelance experience compared to freelancers in the US. So there's still a pretty big gap in the amount of experience. All freelancers came closer to their income goals than freelancers in the US. About 13% more freelancers in the US and Canada made less than they expected to, and about 5% made more than they expected to. I also pulled some data from the American Medical Writers Association. We do a compensation report every 2 years. They don't ask the same questions, so the data really can't be compared to the barometer, but this gives a little bit of a flavor of what's going on. And also, the last survey was 2024 with data for 2023, so it's a few years older. So not as relevant, but again, some picture. And it does show you that rates are going up, which is a good sign for us. And the respondents had an average of 11.8 years of experience. About 70% had at least 10 years of experience in medical communications before they started freelancing. I also thought it would be interesting to show you where most of the work and income is coming from. So you can see here the biggest clients were pharma and biotech, followed by MedComms and MedEd. And the biggest chunks of income came from regulatory writing, scientific pubs, and AMWA called it continuing education, which I'm assuming means continuing accredited medical education and also education that's not accredited. So the rest of my presentation is a little bit of interpretation of what's going on and what I think people can do about it. There's more freelancers out there. I'm sure you've all seen that. And the rise of AI, both of those things mean that there is less work for us. These data are not specific to medical writers. They're just general statistics for freelancing in general, but I'm sure it's indicative of freelance medical communicators also. The number of freelancers, and a lot of this started during COVID, it's increasing dramatically. I don't have any data for Europe, but I have seen data for global data, and it's very similar. So I'm sure that in Europe, the number of freelancers and the number of freelance medical communicators is also increasing rapidly. So if you embrace AI, you're going to thrive. And if you don't, you're going to become extinct. I know that Eleanor talked about a lot of the ethical issues, but as she showed in the slide where people talked about how they used AI, there are many good uses that don't require you to break confidentiality, use proprietary data, or any of those types of things. The good news is AI cannot do medical communications cheaper, faster, and better than humans. Right now, things are in flux with our clients because they're experimenting with how to use AI, the best ways to do this. Most of them are finding that they cannot do it cheaper, faster, and better. At the 2025 AMWA conference, there were a lot of sessions about AI and a lot of discussion about it. And I heard from and talked to a lot of people from pharma and other clients and vendors. And, when they try to do this with no or minimal human oversight, it's a disaster. So I think things are going to even out where they're going to see those who are trying to use AI too much at this point, they're going to see that it's not effective and bring humans back in a bigger role. AI cannot replace our judgment or our subject matter expertise. It does not do nuances, which are critical in the type of work that we do. We humans are much better at things like interpreting evidence, applying guidelines and standards, understanding regulatory, ethical, and compliance boundaries, and knowing when AI is wrong, incomplete, or misleading. And those are three very, very big problems with AI. But our role is definitely shifting. We need to be aware of this. It's changing how we work and what clients need us to do. And we're moving into a more strategic and less just writing role. So things that freelancers will need to do, decide what belongs in the content and what does not, synthesize things across studies, inputs, and stakeholder comments, anticipate reviewer, regulator, or audience questions, and make defensible choices in gray areas. So there's still a lot of work for us out there. It's just going to shift a little bit. And if you want to learn more, Ed Gandy runs High Income Business Freelancing, and he is very, very big into AI and how writers can become strategists, should become strategists to succeed in this current environment. So you could take a look at his website. So despite these changes, I am optimistic about our future. And I think that these are the three things that we can and should be doing to thrive in this environment. 1 and 2 are mandatory. Number 3 depends on your current skills and experience. It's very important that we show clients that we understand their world and can meet their needs. And that means doing consistent client-focused marketing. Most freelance medical writers and editors struggle with marketing and put this last, even though it's very important. And those who do consistent client-focused marketing will rise. AI isn't going away. Eleanor mentioned some people are concerned about the environmental impact, and I do understand that that is a very, very real concern. But whether an individual or a few people use it or not is not going to make a difference. And we have no control over that. And if you want to stay a freelance medical writer or editor, you need to embrace it. And if you're new, you want to build your skills by getting more training. Fortunately, there are now lots and lots of great courses and programs out there from professional associations and seasoned freelancers, for example, in CME, medical and scientific communications, and medical copywriting. So that's it. And this is my contact info.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Laurie. I think that's a really fascinating view of the data from the US perspective and some very insightful comments and thoughts at the end there. Super. Thank you. So, Heather, now can we turn to the European perspective and hear from you, please?
Hi, everyone. Yep, I will try and share
Interesting.
screen. Uh, Can you all see that?
Yeah. And yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, hi everybody. Yes, so I was tasked with basically comparing the overall data with what's pertinent for the EU. And sorry, I'm blocking my screen with that. So there were only 33 responses from the EU, so it's not a great big data set to compare to the overall. But I think it still gave us some interesting insights into some of the potential differences. Italy was the most the most responders came from Italy, and there was obviously very many countries that weren't represented within this survey. I can't. So one of the big differences that I found between the overall MedComms experience between the EU and everybody else was that there was a bigger percentage of people in the EU that were in the first 5 years of their MedComms career, and those that were over 20 years, there was only just over 10% that had more than 20 years experience, compared to 30% in the overall. But although there was those differences in the overall MedComms experience between the EU and everybody else, the overall freelance experience was comparable. I think kind of across the board, but even maybe more so in Europe, there was a 18% lower work satisfaction with the amount of the hours that we worked last year. And inevitably, then the income was less than expected in 52% of people within Europe, compared to 31% of people outside. And interestingly, within the EU population, 12% actually reduced their hourly rate, which was only 4% if you are outside Europe. So I don't know whether that could be because we reduced our rates because kind of a bit desperation to find more work. I don't know. It would be really, like I say, this is quite a small data set, but it would be really interesting to find out why that might be. Also, interestingly, there were more Europeans that had between 51 and 75% of their income in one client. And this was a much lower percentage in the people outside of Europe. There was only 26% that had that amount of income from one client. So I think outside Europe, people tend to spread the amount of clients that they have more, or at least their income across more clients. However, one thing that I did find interesting, and this may be a cultural thing, because obviously you can tell from my accent, although I'm representing Europe and I live in France, I'm actually British. But it was really interesting that the work-life balance was 8.03 in Europe compared to 7.74 outside. So even though we complain that we don't have maybe as many work hours as we would have wanted, we have a better work-life balance. This is even more of a smaller data set, but something that was really interesting with regards to how many hours, whether we were satisfied with the hours we worked or not. There were 3 countries in particular that said that they didn't work as many hours as they would have wanted, and that's France, Germany, and Spain. They did. There was only, this is only N of 18, so it's even smaller. Obviously, it's not even just over half of the whole of Europe. But they reported that they had less overall experience in MedComms. But compared to the N of 33, so the whole of Europe, they were comparable in their freelance experience. In these 3 countries, the overall hourly rate and overall income was lower, and these were the countries where people also decreased their rate last year. Interestingly, though, within this population, 11% said that it was easy to find work in 2025, but it was only 0 for the group who worked as many hours as they wanted. So although this group said it was easy to find work, they still didn't work as many hours as they wanted. So there's kind of some strange disparity, and like I say, it's such a small population that we don't really know why that might be, or even if it's a true reflection. Excuse me. And this group, obviously, I think it goes without saying that they were more likely to stop freelancing. So the countries in Europe that did the best with regards to how many hours they wanted to work was Italy and Portugal. They did overall have slightly more clients that they worked for, and a marginally higher percentage of regulatory, promotional, and online content work. And again, I don't know if this is a real reflection, but it was interesting just to pick out these data points. So the next question was whether we are any better or worse at networking within Europe. 55% of people within Europe were members of the European Medical Rights Association, and only 16 outside of the EU were members. This quite surprised me because obviously outside of the EU, UK is included in that. So there's a few people within the UK that are M1 members. Excuse me, sorry. In the European population, 48% of people were both MedCom Workbook members and attended the MWA Freelance Forum that just happens twice a year and is part of the MWA Freelance package. And only 10% in the non-EU population, only 10% were members of MWA and 58% were members of MedComms Workbook. So MedComms Workbook wins. Interestingly, also within the EU, even though there was a high percentage of people that said they didn't work as many hours as they wanted to, the 33% didn't do any professional networking. But this was even higher, 52% for those outside of the EU. Comparing that question 5, there were no real differences in the differences in professional memberships, or no difference in the types of networking groups and the satisfaction with hours that they actually worked. Therefore, I don't know if the networking strategy is likely to be the reason for difficulty in finding work within Europe. I obviously caveated all of that with low numbers. So the similarities between the EU and non-EU, as Eleanor touched upon, more than 80% of both cohorts did not use commercial recruiters. Now, I would be really interested to know what the block is for using recruiters. In a previous life, when I worked in clinical trials as a freelancer, I used recruiters all the time and I found them to be really useful. But since moving into medical writing, I've had nothing but bad experiences with recruiters. And it may be somewhere where we can tap into if there are some recruiters that we could bring into the fold that we would really trust. I have only one recruiter that I've dealt with in the past that I would trust implicitly for the right role for me and the right client for me. And as Eleanor touched upon, I'm sure that there are others that we all could trust to be better recruiters for our profession, because I think that's the gap at the moment. So I don't know if this is something that we could work on either within or outside of the EU. And the other similarities really were the roles and description were really similar. Therefore, I don't think that the lower income within the EU has anything to do with the actual roles that we do. As the overall data said, most people had around 4 clients. Again, difficult to tell because of the number of respondents. And there was equal use for the use of AI, both in how much we're using it and the type of tasks that we use it for. The overall data was very similar to the EU data.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yes,
That's kind of the overall. It wasn't really very detailed, but
yeah, that's lovely. It's great to hear about the European perspective, and I think in a moment we can potentially touch on some of the points that you've brought up. But I do want to go over to Steph, who is going to be covering the UK perspective, which I have saved till last because it is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the biggest group of respondents to the survey. So Steph, over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks Eleanor. Yeah, so I've only got a few slides just summarising. Oh, I can't seem to turn my slide. Oh, there I am. So, yeah, summarising the findings from the UK perspective. And what I've done is I've compared it to what I've called the non-UK groups. That's the 102 people who completed the survey who weren't in the UK. So there are 162 of us in the UK who replied. As Eleanor mentioned, we were predominantly medical writers. About 70% of us were medical writers, about 10% were editors, and then a very small number of other roles. We were, by and large, very experienced. We had an average of about 15 years experience in the MedComms industry, which was a little bit higher than what we're seeing outside of the UK. And we had an average of about 8 years freelancing experience, which is similar to what we're seeing outside the UK. The one point I will make is that there has been a lot of discussion in freelancing groups recently about the number of new freelancers that have started, perhaps as a result of redundancies due to agency mergers. So I had a quick look at that, and what I found is that actually 1 in 8 of the UK respondents did have less than a year's experience as a freelancer. So there does seem to be quite a number of new freelancers in the UK and responding to this survey. In terms of our clients, UK freelancers had about 4 clients on average last year, which was very slightly lower to outside the UK. As Eleanor kind of alluded to, we are still relying quite heavily on just 1 or 2 clients. We have a quarter of us have only 1 or 2 clients, which is actually higher than seen outside the UK. And more than half of us are having more than half of our income generated by 1 client. So we do seem to perhaps be dependent on just one or two clients in the UK. But in good news, 72% of us did work as many hours as we want. And this does seem to be quite a lot higher than outside of the UK. And I haven't looked at the data properly, but perhaps that's actually driven by the US situation based on the slides that Laurie showed. And again, looking at recruiters, about 14% of us acquired work through a recruiter, so not really very many at all. Let's move on. In terms of our income, so 78% of us matched or exceeded our income in 2025, which is a bit higher than we're seeing outside of the UK. And then looking at the rates, nearly all of us either increased our rates or kept the rates the same, and that was broadly similar across everybody in the entire survey. Not many people seem to have decreased their rates this year. And then satisfaction-wise, 78% of freelancers in the UK were either satisfied or very satisfied with freelancing, and a very high number, really, 80% considered themselves unlikely or very unlikely to stop freelancing. And these values were massively different to what was seen outside the UK. In terms of AI, again, not really much different to what Eleanor showed, really. Perhaps more people in the UK are reluctant to use AI than outside the UK. 26% of us claim not to be using it at all. As in the main group, most of us are using it for brainstorming, literature searches, and explaining complex concepts. In terms of training, again, not really much different between the UK and everywhere else. Freelancers are interested in training, mainly either online or in live sessions rather than one-to-one. But a quarter of people in the UK aren't really looking for further training at the moment. And those who are looking for training are mostly interested in training on AI or on long-term career options. In terms of professional organisations and networking, this was a bit surprising to me in some ways, in that 70% of UK freelancers aren't actually a member of any professional organisation, compared with 23% outside the UK. And the numbers at the bottom, you can see that people who are members of professional organisations, there's a few who are a member of ISMAP and a few who are a member of MWA. But what I think is quite surprising is, in my take from this, is it would seem that British freelancers are far less likely to be members of MWA than American freelancers are to be members of AMWA. And although I said this is surprising, in many ways it isn't, because I've let my membership at ISMAP lapse in the last year or two because I felt I wasn't getting much out of it. So maybe a lot of people are thinking the same as me there. Anyway, I thought that was probably the most striking thing I saw in the whole survey, really, comparing the regions. In terms of networking, 72% of UK freelancers are members of the workbook, not surprisingly, because although it's a global workbook, it's UK based, so it's not in some ways surprising. 25% were members of the freelance medical writers in the UK and Ireland group. Obviously not outside the UK workers, we limited to people in the UK and Ireland. 23% were members of Talus, and 22% were members of freelancers in pubs, which is a bit lower than outside the UK, and perhaps that's because it's an American-based grouping. And then, as a final thing, I went through the comments on the question about concerns about the industry, and I tried to sort of group them into main categories. And what I found is that by far the most comments, 30 in total, really were referring to a general concerns about lack of work or work not being predictable. This was followed by a lot of comments on the impact of AI. A lot of people are worried about the effect it's going to have on availability of work. As I kind of mentioned at the beginning, there are concerns about the number of freelancers out there now, and that whether the freelance marketplace has become saturated, and that was raised by a number of people. There was a few comments about the sort of dissatisfaction with the role, feeling undervalued, lack of autonomy, feeling you're not making a positive difference to the world. Some people mentioned the impact of agency mergers, and I think that also goes back to the saturated marketplace as people get made redundant and become freelancers. There's still a few concerns about the impact of IR35 in the UK. And then a small number of people were worried about lack of training, losing touch with industry trends as a freelancer, and also about how we can achieve a good work-life balance. And I think that's all my slides. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Steph. And I would love to sort of open things up to questions, if anybody has anything that they would like to ask. While you are potentially having a think, I would like to just pick up on the point that you made about EMWA membership, in the UK, Steph. So it looks as though only 12% of UK respondents reported being members of EMWA in comparison with around 55 of the European respondents. So, Steph and Heather, what do you think is going on here? I found that really surprising as well.
Yeah, I don't really know, to be honest. I mean, I left just because I thought the meeting was too expensive to go to, so I never went. And that's one other reason I left, isn't that really? I just found the whole thing too expensive, really, for what I got out of it. Um, yeah, I don't know why it's more popular in Europe, though.
Yeah, fair enough. Heather, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Steph, you're absolutely right. And I don't know if any of you know, but I'm the co-interim chair of the freelance special interest group at M1 now. And this is something that we are really passionate about working on because, for example, the membership at MWA, if you aren't a freelancer, obviously you get sponsored to go. And pharmaceutical companies get a discount for sending their members to go, and freelancers get nothing. And unless you're actually volunteering, doing a workshop or seminar or panel discussions, then you don't get any reimbursement for going. And although they're always within Europe, they can be super expensive.
Yeah.
Before I started doing any volunteering there, it would cost me probably €2,500 to go to a meeting. We need to really improve the freelance offerings for MWA, and this is something that me and Beata Volta are really pushing. We found out only today, actually, that because there's also a simultaneous survey the data's just been crunched from MWA, slightly different questions. But of that offering, I think it was 49% of them are freelancers. So if
Goodness.
they're not supporting
Mm,
the freelancers, then there's a big problem. So
that's
it would be
interesting.
really interesting for me and Beata and obviously Emwa, the committee at Emwa, to find out what we can do to improve that for freelancers. Or what do freelancers want
Mm,
from Emwa? Because if it's a European Medical Writing Association, you kind of want that to be the place where we can all go to network, to find new clients, and to keep up with our training, in fact. But what training do freelancers need?
yeah, fantastic points.
I'll get
Sean,
off
you
my soapbox.
no, I think it's great, and it's great to hear that you are on the case. So thank you for that. Yes, Sean, you've raised your hand. Do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Eleanor. First of all, that was brilliant. Thanks so much for that.
You're welcome.
I had a couple of points. I think the first one was your question about whether people are working as many hours as they want. Pardon me. I wonder whether people are working fewer hours, whether that's as many hours as they want. That makes sense. So it's maybe changed that they're working fewer hours, but that's all they want to work.
Yep.
Because MedComms is hard nowadays. Like private equity, like everybody wants to work yesterday. I wonder whether people are working less, but they're happy doing that rather than
Yeah.
just crafting as much as what they used.
That's actually why we phrased the question in that way, rather than are you working 40 hours a week or whatever.
Yeah.
It's, you set however many hours you want to be working, and then are you doing that or not? Are you
Yeah.
being able to fill that time? So that's a
Yeah.
really good point.
My second point was just about the feast or famine. I know MedComms has always been about feast or famine, but I feel like a lot of roles nowadays are quite long term, as in if you're in for quite a few years potentially with clients,
Potentially,
rather
yeah.
than just pick up little bits. And I wonder, because there's so many more freelancers nowadays, when you're in for a few years. But if you're out of an agency, it's a lot harder to actually get another role. So you could be out for quite a long period of time. I wonder whether that's changed compared to previous years. So you could potentially be out of a role for longer because there's more freelancers and more competition.
I think it's definitely a possibility. I think the way that agencies are using freelancers potentially is also changing. That Previously people were looking for very long-term support. And looking for somebody to have that continuity, almost like it was an in-house writer. That may be challenging from an IR35 perspective in the UK, but also it may be that agencies are not able to justify that type of support currently, and so things may be more on a project by project basis. In terms of the opportunities that I've seen coming through the workbook, I think there has been a definite predominance of the project work kind of earlier on in my tenure. I took over in April 2024. I do think there is a shift coming back to the more kind of longer term, chunkier, seeing projects through type approach, but it's not necessarily across the board. So that's a good point. Thank you, Sean. So I'm just having a quick look at the chat. One of the questions I saw early on was around why there are fewer responses this year. And I think this is a really good point. It is something that it's always hard to predict, and it's possible that people are getting a bit of survey fatigue. I think there have been quite a few surveys in the industry recently. Heather was mentioning one that MWA has been running. I know that the UK and Ireland freelancers ran a survey around salaries and rates last year. And there are other surveys available as well, but also this is the third year, so it might well be people going, I've already done that one, I don't need to do it again, do I? I don't know. I think that is a possibility. I think there is definitely more that I could do in terms of connecting with other organisations to tap into networks of freelancers that I'm not necessarily engaged with all the time. I think looking at freelancers who are, for example, in Australia and New Zealand. I know there's quite a few people over there, but we did not get many responses from them. I think I could definitely do more in terms of the European freelancers as well, because that proportion had shrunk in comparison with the previous years. So that's something I'm going to be looking at and thinking about for 2027. But if anybody has any bright ideas, then please do get in touch, because I am always open to suggestions and other kind of input from that perspective. Okay, I'm just having a look at the chat for any other questions. There's a question here about the percentage of freelancers who got work from recruiters. So what other avenues people use to get work? This is a really good one. Now, obviously, as the person running the MedComms workbook, I would say that is a great place to get work opportunities from. So do sign up. But on a more serious note, I think having access to any kind of network where work opportunities are going to be circulated, or where there is some form of directory that clients can access. So I know that MWA and AMWA both have directories. There's also organisations like Talus and Farmalancers and the Resilient Collective and other freelance focused organisations that are not going to be dealing with permanent positions necessarily. Heather, looks like you have something to say as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add when you said about the directories, because there is the MWA freelance directory, but it's a paid for service. And that again is something that we want to kind of make more visible and make more, because I used to be on it and I came off of it because I didn't ever get one client. So if freelancers would be interested in that, then it's something else we need to work out what information we need to put on there and work out better visibility as well.
Yeah.
If it's going to be of use to anyone, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Super. Thank you. Are there any other questions that you would like to ask? Because I'm very aware that we have taken up the whole hour now. I think if there's nothing that anybody is desperate to ask right now, I'm going to say thank you very much to my fantastic guests, Heather, Laurie and Steph. Thank you so much for taking the time to look at the data and present with me today. Thank you very much to everyone who has responded to the survey, and thank you to everyone who has come here today to join us for this discussion. I will be sharing the recording very soon, so do watch out for that. So thank you.